Tato. Thank you, John. I thought I was going after the next person. I was just sitting there thinking, I'm glad I don't have to follow TJ. So how wrong was I? So what a pleasure it is to be here, to be thinking about the digital Pacific. And that's really what I'm talking about today. We're in the midst of an enormous set of changes in the Pacific, and we don't really see where we're going. And so for research, that constitutes a new moment and a really exciting moment. And I think that opportunity is something that, particularly in the New Zealand Institute of Pacific Research, that's nzipr.ac.nz, that we're really excited by because of the criticality of these changes that we're seeing. And so what I'm going to do today is really discuss the research that we're seeing coming out about the digital Pacific, as I call it, and possible areas of need and actually some challenges that we face. Now, digital research has been underway for over a decade, and we've seen some real strengths. We've seen some real strengths develop, and I think a lot of these strengths have been driven by, I'll just keep going off my notes. That's the digital Pacific, and I guess that's part of it. There's some real strengths, and a lot of them are coming out of government-led and development-led programs. So we're seeing real strengths in research and knowledge about digital development, around policy and regulation, and as we've seen, I think already this morning, around questions of digital infrastructure, tech infrastructure. But I think what we haven't really come to terms with is a whole range of other issues that are clearly already really urgent when we think about the Pacific. One of these is that the arrival of digital technologies in the Pacific has challenged a lot of previous assumptions, particularly around what was private and what was public. And we know that's true across technology across the world, but I think in the Pacific it's been particularly marked. So there's a challenge to what constitutes privacy everywhere, but there's particularly a challenge to what public is in this sense. When you get places like, particularly in Polynesia, where you have very strongly established local publics and villages and those places, and then you have the kind of deregulation and policies we're seeing which are encouraging a private model of ICT infrastructure. So that is, we've gone away from the idea of these things as a public utility and entirely gone over to the idea of ICT infrastructure as a commercial marketplace. We're dealing with questions about consumer digitality, and I'll talk more about that, but I think in the Pacific particularly, I think Nano Girl was describing it as, the digitality is a reading digitality, that is, people are getting their iPhones and they're really responding to consumer devices. It's not an industrial or a maker digitality. And I guess there's all sorts of questions really around what is this doing to our Pacific cultures? What is the downstream effect of this, this massive set of changes? And I think already we have some really big questions being raised in a place like New Zealand about how can digital cultures be used to transform people's health, their well-being, their wealth, and we don't know the answers to most of these questions. There's an interesting bunch of studies. Can you use social media to help people stop smoking? Can you use social media to help them or reduce their exposure to diabetes and bad food? These are live areas of research, and we don't know how that's going to pan out. And I guess one of the things which I think is really important on a day like today is thinking about the deep inequalities that are built into the way we're rolling out ICT infrastructure and digital culture in the Pacific. And so what we have is a set of research that is really quite strong in just a couple of areas. For instance, digital development, because a lot of the funding is coming in focused on these areas, and so a lot of the research is gravitating to those areas as well. We know, for instance, there was a group of telecentres developed in Samoa that have been well studied, probably weren't deemed by many of those who looked on as successes. We've also got the UNDP's e-government projects. So those sorts of things are well studied, well tracked, and have taught us a lot about what we can do and what we can't do in digital development. And I think probably the bulk has really been around the regulatory environment and policies to do with ICT in the Pacific. So most Pacific nations now have national ICT strategies, they have regulators, they have a regulatory framework that has allowed or has facilitated a shift from a public utility model to a private market model of ICT. So there's a lot going on, and the researchers are pretty much sprinting to keep up because it's happening very fast. And there are some real problems around how one does the research for these things. If you think, for instance, about the shift from public to private, that has all sorts of ramifications for researchers who could access public data but can't access private data unless it's shared. I think that means we don't know what we don't know in the Pacific. If you think, for instance, in the big things that we know. So we're looking at a shift in the Pacific that is clearly substantial and it's rapid. And I guess we're all assuming that it's revolutionary. And I think that's probably something we need to be careful. How deep, how broad, and how fast does this change? And have we seen it before, I guess? I know if we look at sort of coarse measures, like this one, so this is the number of mobile users per 100 persons in Samoa and Tonga. And even like the methodology of how we count mobile users is very sketchy and differs. So unless you're using uniform data sets, it's a real struggle. And if you look at the big publicly available uniform data sets, and you look at the Pacific, for instance, the ones I drew this from, the ITU, most of those data sets are simply blank. So they're actually very difficult to track in the ways that we track other things as researchers. I think even with this one, which I think is the method is more stable across different data sets. We're seeing massive increases from year to year at scales that we haven't seen before. So we do know that this is something that is substantial and new. But I always pause before I say it's revolutionary. And I guess my own research, which is currently I've got a Marsden project around technological change in Samoa. And so if you imagine Samoa not as the place that it's depicted, a technological backwater, but you reimagine what we know to be true, that most or a large proportion of the recent sort of technological development in the last 150 years has been concentrated on places we would describe as colonies of the third world. They're often more accessible to change. And so, like for instance, this is the old German radio master Napier that was the focus of the First World War efforts. That was state of the art. It was one of the first of its kind built. And it wasn't an accident. And what we saw in Samoa was Samoa skipped a generation of technology. It had no wired, it didn't have a telegraph. It went straight to a wireless telegraphy. Right? And that's very common if we look around the sort of underdeveloped, developing or third world, that technologies don't come in the same order that they're imagined in other places. And that's often driven by other things, principally cost and availability. And that's what we're seeing in the Pacific. So Samoa went straight to television. Colour television was almost available from day one. Right? Radio came late in the Pacific, but we got actually quite powerful radio transmitting sets, and we got radio with ideas about distance education. So you get all sorts of technological change that I think are really important. And if you imagine societies like Samoa or Tonga or Fiji or Papua New Guinea, they're very used to dealing with these kinds of technological shifts. And we've yet to see these cultures destroyed by that shift. Right? They've responded innovatively and they've localized these technologies. But that's not to say this is not different. Right? For instance, we know that unlike many of these other technologies, we're dealing with major global players. So Samoans are on Facebook now. They were on Bebo. They were actually on a segmented. So when did Bebo become funny? But we actually saw the fragmenting of social media, and now we're seeing an aggregating of it into just a few big social media platforms. And Pacific people are within that process. We know that, and it's been well established, that this revolution, if we call it that, is a mobile one, and it's probably, the data's not good around this, but everyone knows who's been in the Pacific, it's probably an Android one as well. Right. We know that there are limitations of infrastructure. So the intra-island connectivity is good because you can stick a few towers up in certain Pacific Islands and get good coverage, but the inter-island connectivity is very limited, as we heard MFAT talk about this morning. And we also know that in the Pacific, and I think this is important to show the response being so different, the consumers are much more sensitive to network, which was true in New Zealand 15 years ago. But in Samoa, everyone knows, for instance, which network the number they're calling is on, because it's priced that way. So you make a Blue Sky call, preferably on a Blue Sky phone, and a Vodafone on a Vodafone, and in New Zealand no one does it. So this is not that that's an old story, it's rather that this is just a different way of engaging with the technology. Right? And I think, for me, when we think about inequality, the thing to remember is that in the Pacific, and this is likely to be true for some time into the future, it's not a plain economy, it's a prepay economy of digital engagement. And so that is very different. And it's actually part of what's really exciting about this, because very few things pay as you go in New Zealand. Right? But in Samoa, electricity is all sorts of other things you have. It's a different way of imagining and engaging with the market. And I think it's really important. So we know that this digitality, this engagement with digital culture is going to be different in the Pacific. We know, for instance, that remittances, and we need a whole lot of work around what digital transmission of money means, because it's obviously already changing the actual remitting behaviour and the levels of it. It used to be you sent big amounts of remittances, and they seem to be related to particular events in the islands, and now you see smaller levels because it only costs you $3 to send through Digicel money. Right. So there's all sorts of changes that come back into ordinary lives from that. There's new opportunities, for instance, for peer education, peer communication. So for instance, 40 years ago it was quite difficult if you were 15 to talk to a 15-year-old Samoan girl, if you're a 15-year-old Samoan boy. Now, and this is a very real problem, right, or a real challenge, is now it's very easy. You couldn't call up people from landline to landline because everyone could overhear what you're saying on the phone. And so we're actually seeing all these amazing challenges to ways of bringing up children that are particularly impacting on our young people. New content and subjects, and you can imagine the kind of content that 15-year-old boys want to look at on the internet. Right? And it was actually very difficult to do it in most of the Pacific, and now it's very easy. So what does that mean? I've had conversations with the head of state of Samoa who's concerned about Samoan consumption, particularly amongst teenage boys, of pornography. That's where they're getting their information from, because the tradition in Samoa is not for parents to share it. So these are really profound challenges that we're seeing. And I think the other one that I'd like to mention is what they call micro-organisation. It's now very easy, to say, Sefa, I'm going to be 10 minutes late to Aggie's wait. Once upon a time it was very difficult to organise large groups of, small groups of Samoans to come together. Now it's very easy. And so it's actually changed it's changed what time means. Late in Samoa used to be the wrong day, I suspect. And now late means something like it means at all. You said you'd be here 5 minutes ago. So how profound are those shifts? And we don't really understand them very well. Now I think what many of you will be familiar with is the changes in the political economy. I've already hinted to the ways in which the utility model has gone and the market model really rules in the Pacific. And it certainly has done a number of things. It's made mobile phone connectivity so much cheaper. And that's really the driver. The driver hasn't been a technological driver in the Pacific. It's largely been a price driver. It's gotten so much cheaper, and that's allowed people to go and get phones. And Samoa learned that the hard way when they first of all tried a kind of public utility model in the mobile market. In 1996, they gave too long a license, and all the regulators ended up regretting it. So that's all very interesting, and I think the other thing that's really interesting is that the proportion of GDP of these ICT companies in most Pacific economies is really high. And everyone knows this when you go to Tonga or Fiji, because you see who sponsors their rugby teams, right? Usain Bolt and the Fijian Sevens team are sponsored by Digicel, right? So we already know that they're big players in their domestic markets. 4.4% is the number of GDP, their median proportion. So they're private sector leaders in each of these Pacific economies. They're the superheroes, and particularly the private growth in these economies. I think there's Digicel, and many of us have long been curious about Digicel. It's a privately held company, and they flirted with public. Last year, they were down most of the way down the path to an IPO, and so we learned more about Digicel in that period than many of us knew. I mean, there's plenty of people in this room that know a lot about Digicel, including one of our speakers to come. But we know that they're real behemoths in the Pacific, and they've come up with a business model that clearly works, and it works everywhere from Haiti to Fiji, and that actually is something that we can learn about, not just in ICT, but across the private sector. How exactly it works, it's kind of a high volume, low margin model, but it clearly works very well. And I guess that really brings me to sort of wrapping it up. So that there are really big questions that researchers are going to struggle with in a largely private, largely market-driven research field. I think what we're seeing is a good start. I, of course, would like to have better data than what I have in order to understand these things. But if you imagine trying to look under the hood of a Google or a Facebook, it isn't going to happen. I mean, Google's business model is its algorithm. The people that pay Google a lot of money don't get access to it either, so they're certainly not going to give it to humble researchers like we in the academy. But I think there are some clear challenges that go along with that. There are going to be some real ongoing issues with the underlying infrastructure of the market. Right? So unless the Pacific moves to some sort of service delivery model, which is entirely thinkable in the distant future, it's going to still need to actually move things around. And we've heard moving things around in the Pacific is already as expensive as it ever was, probably. Whereas everywhere else, it's gotten a lot cheaper. I think we probably need to rethink the focus on the consumer nature of Pacific digitality. That is, we use the platforms as we receive them. We buy the handsets from China. We buy the software and all of that, towards an economy that will support some sort of innovation within the Pacific and some sort of growth. I think we really have to better understand how this is going to change people, because that really is the bigger question. And we don't understand that very well. What about those adolescents? What about people, especially the Polynesian nations who are spread across 2/3 of the world? How is ICT going to impact on them? And I guess we really need to think about the unevenness and indeed inequality of access to this, which will continue. So we know most wired telephones in most Pacific nations, something like 3/4 of them are in the urban areas. Right? We don't know quite as well about the urban-rural distribution of phones. We know that in the rural areas they've got them, but we don't know to what degree. And we've got metered access to the phone and the internet. So we need to understand that. And it's actually difficult. None of the data we collect tells us about a prepay economy, not very much of it. Of course, the great gift of the Pacific is they're young. And so we now have millions of Pacific people who are digital natives. But they're digital natives in a particular digital environment that is largely consumer-led and highly deregulated. But just having that critical mass is a seedbed of innovation. We know that. Right? So we just need to deliver opportunities for them. And those opportunities will often come through the new connections they can make. So the inter-island connectivities will become particularly important. But unless these young people have access to sort of value-add activities like education, it's going to be very challenging. And then I think what we're anticipating, and I don't know if this is true or not, I mean, the data suggests it is that it will keep getting cheaper. So that the internet will keep getting closer even as it remains unequal. So I guess what I'm saying is the digital future is full of challenges, but for the Pacific and for Pacific researchers, it's very, very bright. Thank you.